Mr. James sat in his home office, surrounded by the sleek furniture and cutting-edge technology that symbolized his success. A sense of pride swelled within him as he reviewed the final details of the multi-million-dollar deal he was about to close. This meeting wasn't just important, it was life-changing. A business merger of this magnitude would elevate him to new heights in the corporate world. His legacy, wealth, and influence would grow exponentially, and nothing could stand in his way. His assistant had already called twice to remind him of the meeting, but Mr. James, a man who prided himself on his punctuality, wasn't concerned. He always arrived at the perfect time, never too early, never too late. He closed his leather-bound portfolio, his gaze wandering toward the large floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. The world outside seemed to hum with energy, the streets below bustling with people, cars, and the never-ending stream of city life. It was a constant reminder of how far he'd come from his humble beginnings. James straightened his tie in the reflection of the window and checked his watch. He still had a little time before he needed to head out, but he could feel the pressure building inside him. This deal was too important to leave anything to chance. He picked up his phone and texted his driver to bring the car around. It was time to seal the deal and secure his future. As he walked through the foyer of his opulent mansion, his steps quick and purposeful, he suddenly felt a strange sense of unease. He shook it off, telling himself it was just pre-meeting nerves. He had been in high-stakes situations before, and this was no different. Success was about taking risks, and no one knew that better than him. Just as he reached for the door, something unexpected happened. A voice, soft yet urgent, called his name from across the yard. He turned to see a woman rushing toward him, waving her hands to catch his attention. It was the nurse from the hospital, where he had been a few weeks ago for a routine checkup. He hadn't thought much about the brief interaction they'd had then, but now, here she was, standing on his property, visibly distressed. "Mr. James, please wait," she called out, her voice trembling with urgency. He stood still, confused by the unexpected encounter. What could a nurse possibly want with him now, at this critical moment? His mind immediately raced to thoughts of a medical issue. Maybe the hospital had found something in his test results. But no, that didn't make sense. If it were a medical emergency, surely they would have contacted him formally, not sent someone rushing to his doorstep. Before he could respond, she reached him, her face flushed, breathing heavily as if she had run a long way. Her name was Nurse Julia, if he recalled correctly, and she looked deeply unsettled. "Mr. James," she panted, "you can't go to that meeting. Please, you have to listen to me." James frowned, irritated but more curious than anything. He didn't like being told what to do, least of all by someone he hardly knew. "What are you talking about?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm, but feeling his patience already thinning. "I don't have time for this. I have somewhere I need to be." Nurse Julia shook her head frantically, her eyes wide and pleading. "I know this sounds crazy, but I had to warn you. Something terrible is going to happen if you go to that meeting. You can't go. Please, believe me." He stared at her in disbelief. This had to be some kind of joke, or maybe she was mistaken about something. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, his tone growing sharper. "I've worked too hard to let some vague warning keep me from this deal. I have no idea why you're here, but I can't waste any more time." Julia grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Mr. James, please, just listen for a minute. I know this doesn't make sense to you, but I'm telling you, if you go to that meeting, something awful is going to happen. You won't come back. I've seen something, I've heard something, it's not safe." Her words hung in the air, and for the first time, James felt a chill run down his spine. It wasn't what she was saying that unnerved him. It was the way she said it, the raw desperation in her voice. She wasn't trying to frighten him for no reason. She believed every word. but still, it made no sense. How could she possibly know what was going to happen at his business meeting? "Julia, I appreciate your concern, but I'm not going to cancel a multi-million-dollar deal because you have a feeling. Do you realize what's at stake here?" "I do," she insisted, her eyes locking onto his. "That's why I'm here. I don't care if you think I'm crazy. I had to come and tell you. I work at the hospital and we had a patient recently. He said something before he passed out. He mentioned your name, your meeting today. He kept saying that you wouldn't make it out alive if you went." James's blood ran cold. "What are you talking about?" he asked, suddenly unsure whether he should be angry or terrified. "What patient?" She hesitated for a moment, as if debating how much to tell him. "I can't give you his name, privacy laws, but he's someone connected to your business, someone involved in this deal. He was delirious, yes, but he knew things about you, things he shouldn't have known. He warned us over and over again that something was going to happen to you today, that you wouldn't survive the meeting." James stared at her, his mind spinning. This was impossible. How could a random patient know anything about him, let alone about his business meeting? It was absurd. And yet there was something about her urgency, her fear, that made him hesitate. He glanced at his watch again. Time was running out. If he didn't leave now, he would be late. His partners were expecting him, and this deal was too important to let go because of some wild story. But what if she was right? What if something did happen? Could he afford to take that risk? "You have to trust me," Julia whispered, her voice breaking through his internal battle. "If you go to that meeting, something terrible will happen. I know you think this sounds crazy, but please just listen to me. Don't go." James took a deep breath, trying to clear his head. He had been in high-pressure situations before, and he knew how to handle them. But this was different. This wasn't just business. This was his life on the line, if what she said was true. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A reminder from his assistant. The meeting was in 30 minutes, and if he didn't leave now, he wouldn't make it. He looked back at Nurse Julia, who was still staring at him, her eyes filled with terror. For the first time in years, Mr. James felt something unfamiliar gnawing at him. Doubt. Nurse Julia's breath seemed to catch in her throat as she looked up at Mr. James. Her eyes were pleading, searching his face for any sign that he might believe her. His mind was spinning, and he didn't know whether to get in the car and leave her behind or listen for just a little longer. A part of him, the part that had built his empire from nothing, screamed that this was nonsense. He had dealt with manipulative people before, individuals who would try anything to shake his focus. But this felt different. Julia shifted on her feet, as if sensing the tension. "I wasn't going to come here, Mr. James," she said softly, almost as though confessing a secret. "I wasn't going to get involved. But this isn't just some irrational feeling. You deserve to know more." Her hands trembled as she clasped them together, and for a moment she seemed lost in thought, gathering her words. Mr. James watched her with growing impatience, yet he found himself unable to pull away. "You keep saying it's not safe for me to go," he said, frustration edging his voice. "But all you've done is give me half of a story. Why? What's really going on here?" Julia blinked rapidly, and for a brief second a flash of fear crossed her face. She took a deep breath before speaking again. "A few days ago I was working the night shift. It was quiet until a man came in, unconscious, badly injured. At first I thought it was just another routine emergency case, but when we started to treat him, he became delirious." She paused and seemed to weigh her words carefully. "He kept muttering names, and one of them was yours." Mr. James narrowed his eyes, his mind racing. "My name?" he asked incredulously. "What exactly did he say?" "He wasn't coherent at first," she admitted, "but after he stabilized, it was clear. He knew about your business. He spoke about the meeting today, the people involved, and he He warned that you wouldn't survive if you went." Her voice cracked slightly as she continued. "He spoke like he'd seen it happen already, like it was a certainty." James shook his head, his skepticism returning. "You're telling me that some random man at the hospital is having visions of my future? Come on, Julia. You must know how insane this sounds." Julia flinched, but her resolve didn't waver. "I know it sounds impossible, but there's more." She looked around nervously, as if checking to see if anyone else was listening. "The man wasn't just some random patient. He knew things about your business. Details only someone closely involved would know. At first, I didn't understand it myself, but when I looked into his background, I discovered he was linked to your deal." This revelation hit James hard. He had been dismissing Julia's story as a case of a superstitious nurse latching onto a coincidence. But now, things were starting to align in ways he hadn't expected. "Linked to my deal? Who is this man?" Julia bit her lip, her gaze dropping to the ground as if she was about to say something she wasn't supposed to. "I can't tell you his name. Medical confidentiality laws prevent it. But what I can tell you is that he was once involved in the very business arrangement you're about to finalize. He had a major stake in it, until everything fell apart for him. And I think he knew something. Something dangerous." James's jaw tightened. "You're saying this man, this ex-partner or whatever he was, is predicting something bad will happen to me if I go to this meeting? And you think that's enough reason for me to risk walking away from a deal worth millions?" Julia's eyes snapped back up to his. "I'm not asking you to believe in visions or premonitions, Mr. James. But you need to know this man wasn't just raving. He knew your name. He knew you were attending this meeting today, and he was terrified for you. When he came out of unconsciousness, his first coherent words were a warning. For you." James crossed his arms, still wrestling with his doubt. Everything about this felt wrong, but there was something about the way Julia spoke that got under his skin. She wasn't trying to manipulate him for money or power. She seemed genuinely afraid, and her fear had nothing to do with anything tangible. "Let's say I believe you," he said, carefully measuring his words. "Let's say this man did know something. What exactly do you expect me to do? Cancel the meeting? Lose the deal? How would I even explain it to my partners?" Julia took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. "I'm not asking you to throw everything away, but maybe just delay it. Reschedule for a day. Give it some time until we can figure out more about what's going on." James could feel the pressure rising. He checked his watch again, noting that time was running out. If he didn't leave soon, he'd miss the entire meeting. His phone buzzed in his pocket again, another reminder. Yet the doubt that had been gnawing at him earlier had grown into something deeper, something he couldn't easily shake off. This wasn't like him at all. Normally, he would never entertain such a wild story. But there was something about Julia's persistence, her fear, and now this mysterious man's involvement that planted a seed of hesitation. Could he really afford to ignore it? His mind raced through the possible scenarios. If he rescheduled, he would appear unreliable to his partners. The deal might fall through and millions could be lost. On the other hand, if he ignored this bizarre warning and something did happen, he couldn't shake the feeling that Julia was right. "I have to go," he finally said, his voice firm but uncertain. "I don't have time to stand here any longer. My business depends on it." Julia's eyes filled with panic again, but she didn't move to stop him this time. Instead, she whispered, "Mr. James, please. This isn't about business anymore. This is about your life. You don't know what's waiting for you in that room today, but this man did. He tried to warn you. I'm just asking you to think about it." James took one last look at her, feeling a strange mixture of frustration and fear knotting his stomach. He didn't have time for this. But as he turned to walk toward the car, her final words echoed in his mind. "You won't make it out alive if you go." He hesitated for a second, just a second, and in that brief moment, everything seemed to shift. His pulse quickened. His breath caught in his throat. Was it possible that he was walking straight into danger? And if so, would he even know until it was too late? He shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. This was madness. The meeting was just another step in his plan, a calculated risk like all the others. But somehow, this time felt different. The decision weighed on him like never before. If he turned around and canceled the meeting, there was no going back. But if he walked through that door, there might be no second chance to walk out. In the end, James did what he always did. He made the call. He turned away from the car, pulling out his phone, and made a single call to his assistant. "Cancel the meeting," he said, his voice steady. "We'll reschedule." He ended the call and turned back toward Julia, who was standing motionless, as if holding her breath. "You'd better be right," he muttered, more to himself than to her. And with that, he walked back toward his house, wondering if he had just made the most important decision of his life. An hour passed since Mr. James made the difficult decision to cancel the meeting. He sat in his study, staring blankly at his phone, unable to shake the lingering tension from his conversation with Nurse Julia. His rational mind still struggled with what had just happened. It was ridiculous to think he had postponed a deal of this magnitude over the ramblings of a panicked nurse and the incoherent warnings of some stranger in a hospital bed. He couldn't believe that he, of all people, had fallen prey to something so absurd. The silence in his mansion felt thick, almost oppressive, as if the house itself was questioning his decision. His office, usually a place of control and confidence, felt different now, quieter, emptier, like the calm before a storm. He glanced at his watch again. It was well past the time he should have been at the meeting. The deal would be wrapping up by now, and his phone should have been buzzing with updates from his partners. But there was nothing. No emails, no calls, no messages. Just silence. A flicker of regret tugged at him. Was Julia wrong? Had he let fear cloud his judgment? He imagined his business partners sitting in the meeting room without him, irritated by his last-minute cancellation. This deal had been months in the making, and now he had jeopardized it based on a vague warning about something that might happen. The logical part of him began to whisper that he had made a mistake, that he should have gone. What if this cost him more than he ever imagined? Just as he was about to pick up his phone and reach out to his assistant for an update, the silence was shattered by the sharp, piercing sound of a news alert from his phone. He grabbed it quickly, thinking it might be about the deal or a message from one of his partners. But when he looked at the screen, his blood ran cold. The headline read, "Explosion at Midtown Conference Center. Multiple casualties reported." His heart thudded in his chest as he read the words again, hoping he had misunderstood. But there it was, clear, undeniable. The Midtown Conference Center, where his meeting had been scheduled, had just suffered a catastrophic explosion. The very building he was supposed to be in at that very moment had been reduced to rubble. His hands trembled as he tapped on the article, his mind racing to process the details. According to the report, the explosion had occurred just as the meeting was getting underway. A gas leak in the building had gone unnoticed until it was too late. The explosion had been sudden and devastating, blowing out windows, collapsing parts of the structure, and trapping people inside. Emergency crews were on the scene, trying to rescue the survivors, but many had already been confirmed dead. James felt the world tilt around him, his vision narrowing as the reality of the situation sunk in. If he had gone to that meeting, he would have been right in the middle of that explosion. He would have been one of those casualties. His heart pounded in his chest, the adrenaline flooding his veins as he realized how close he had come to losing everything. His life, his future, everything he had worked for. It was only because of Julia's warning that he had avoided what would have been certain death. He couldn't breathe for a moment. The weight of what had just happened crashing down on him. He had been standing on the edge of disaster, and he hadn't even known it. He thought back to the moment when he had been ready to dismiss Julia, to push past her and head to the meeting anyway. How close he had come to ignoring her, to walking into that building, never to come out again. His phone rang, jolting him back to the present. It was his assistant, her voice frantic and shaking. "Mr. James, are you okay? Did you see the news? They said the explosion happened right where your meeting was scheduled. I've been trying to reach you. Thank God you canceled." "I'm fine," James said, his voice sounding hollow even to his own ears. "I saw the news. I can't believe it." His assistant let out a shaky breath. "Everyone's in shock. Some of your business partners were inside when it happened. I don't know how many of them made it out." James felt his stomach churn. The thought of his colleagues, people he had worked alongside for years, being caught in the explosion, sickened him. He had been so focused on his own survival that he hadn't even considered the possibility that others hadn't been so lucky. "Have you heard from anyone?" he asked quietly, bracing himself for the answer. "Not yet," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're still waiting for more details. Some of the emergency calls came from inside the building before the explosion, but there hasn't been any confirmation on who made it out and who didn't." James swallowed hard. The gravity of the situation was almost too much to bear. His colleagues, his friends, the people he had shared countless meetings and projects with might be gone. And all because of some unseen threat. A threat that Julia had somehow known about. Julia. The thought of her brought him back to their conversation outside his house just an hour earlier. Her face, pale and frightened, flashed in his mind. She had saved his life. Without her intervention, without her strange and cryptic warning, he would have been dead by now. He stood up, his legs shaky, and paced the room. How had she known? That was the question that now consumed him. How could she have possibly known that something like this was going to happen? The details she gave, the connection to the mysterious patient at the hospital, all of it had felt so outlandish at the time. But now it seemed like she had been right all along. Could it really have been just a coincidence? Or had there been something more? Desperate for answers, James grabbed his keys and left his mansion, heading straight for the hospital where Nurse Julia worked. The drive there felt surreal, the city streets passing by in a blur. His mind was clouded with questions that only Julia could answer. He had to know more about the man she had mentioned, the one who had supposedly known about his meeting and the danger he would be in. Who was he? How did he know so much? When he arrived at the hospital, he rushed inside, his heart racing. He approached the front desk and asked for Nurse Julia. The receptionist raised an eyebrow, clearly startled by his urgency, but directed him to the floor where Julia worked. He navigated the sterile hallways until he found her, standing by a patient's room, her back turned to him. She looked up as he approached, her expression shifting from surprise to concern. "Mr. James?" she asked, her voice tentative. "What are you doing here?" James could barely find the words. "I need answers, Julia. The explosion, the meeting. You knew something was going to happen. How?" Julia's face softened, her eyes filled with a quiet sadness. She took a step closer to him, lowering her voice. "I didn't know exactly what was going to happen," she said softly. "But the patient, the man I told you about, he did." James felt his pulse quicken. "Who is he?" Julia hesitated, as if unsure whether to reveal the truth. "I told you, I can't disclose his identity because of confidentiality, but I did some digging after I saw how frightened he was. He was connected to your business, Mr. James. He was a former partner in the very deal you were about to finalize. He lost everything in that deal. He warned us, warned me that the meeting today would lead to disaster. I didn't believe it at first, but the things he said, they made too much sense. I had to warn you." James stared at her, his mind reeling. A former partner, someone who had been involved in the same deal. It was starting to make sense now, but it still felt unbelievable. Why didn't he just come to me himself?" "He couldn't," Julia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was too sick, too weak, but he made sure I knew enough to warn you. He didn't want what happened to him to happen to you." James felt a wave of emotion crash over him. He had been so close to walking into a trap, so close to losing everything. And it was only because of a stranger's warning passed through a frightened nurse that he was still standing here. His life had been spared, but the questions remained. As he stood there staring at Julia, the weight of what had almost happened settled over him. He had narrowly escaped death, but the mystery of how and why would haunt him forever. And now, he had to live with the knowledge that not everyone had been as lucky as he was. The sterile smell of the hospital clung to the air as Mr. James stood in silence, absorbing the enormity of what Nurse Julia had just revealed. His heart pounded in his chest, and the gravity of his near escape pressed down on him like a weight he couldn't shake. The meeting he had spent weeks preparing for, the one he had been so certain was a turning point in his career, had become a death trap. And it was only because of this enigmatic warning from a man he'd never met that he was still alive. But as the minutes ticked by, standing there in the hospital hallway, James realized that the weight of his survival wasn't the only thing bearing down on him. It was the mystery of who had saved him, and more pressingly, why. "Julia," he said, his voice quieter now, the initial rush of adrenaline giving way to a deeper, gnawing need for answers. "This man, the one who warned you, I need to know more about him. You said he was connected to my business, that he lost everything, but why would he risk telling you? Why not come to me directly?" Nurse Julia looked down, her expression filled with uncertainty. "He was in no condition to come to you," she explained softly. "When he came into the hospital, he was barely conscious. By the time I spoke with him, he was already slipping in and out of delirium. He knew he didn't have long, and I think this was his last chance to warn someone. He was desperate, Mr. James. Desperate to stop you from making the same mistake he did." James felt a chill run down his spine. Mistake. The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. He hadn't thought of the deal as anything other than a tremendous financial opportunity. To him, it had been a business strategy, nothing more, nothing less. But now the suggestion that this man saw it as something far more sinister gnawed at him. "He didn't just see it as a mistake," Julia continued, her eyes locking with his. "He saw it as a trap. Something in that meeting or in the deal itself was wrong. I don't know all the details, but what he said to me, it was clear he believed that the people involved were dangerous, that the business you were walking into wasn't what it appeared to be. He kept repeating that word, trap." James stood there, feeling a cold sweat prickle at the back of his neck. Could it be possible that the deal he had spent months negotiating was tainted with something darker? He thought back to the weeks of meetings, the carefully veiled conversations, and the subtle power plays. He had navigated corporate negotiations for most of his life, always certain that he could see through any deception. But now, a seed of doubt had been planted. "What else did he say?" James asked, feeling a strange sense of urgency. "Did he give any names? Any specifics about the people involved? I need to know everything." Julia shook her head, her frustration evident. "He was too far gone by the time he could speak clearly. The only name he mentioned was yours, and the meeting today. He was fixated on that, like it was the only thing he had left to warn about." James's mind raced, replaying every conversation, every document he had reviewed leading up to the meeting. Could there have been signs he missed? Warnings that, in his ambition, he had overlooked? It seemed impossible, but then again, he had just avoided a disaster that he never saw coming. The explosion had been real. There was no denying that. And had he been there, he likely would not have survived. Julia looked at him with a mix of sympathy and concern. "I know this must be hard to believe. I didn't want to get involved at first. I thought I was overstepping by even coming to you. But after seeing how frantic he was, how convinced he was that your life was in danger, I couldn't just stand by. I'm sorry I couldn't give you more details." James nodded slowly, his thoughts drifting to the faceless man who had risked everything to send this warning. He wasn't sure whether to be angry at the cryptic nature of the message or grateful that it had reached him in time. "I don't know how to thank you," he finally said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "If you hadn't come to me." Julia smiled faintly, the tension in her shoulders easing just a little. "I just did what I thought was right. I'm glad you listened." They stood there in silence for a moment longer, neither of them quite knowing what to say. James's mind, however, was still working furiously. He couldn't just leave things at that. There were too many unanswered questions, too many pieces of the puzzle still missing. He couldn't shake the feeling that this warning had come too late for others, and that the real danger might still be out there. "I need to know who he was," James said, more to himself than to Julia. "I need to find out what happened to him, and why he felt the need to warn me. There's more to this than just a gas leak and an explosion. I can feel it." Julia hesitated, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper. She unfolded it slowly, revealing a handwritten note, something scrawled in a shaky hand. "I wasn't supposed to do this," she said softly. But before he passed out, he wrote down a few words. "He was barely conscious when he did it, but I thought it might mean something to you." She handed the note to James, who unfolded it carefully. The writing was faint and unsteady, but legible. It read, "The meeting is a lie. They know. They always knew." James stared at the words, feeling a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He had no idea what they meant, but he knew they were important. This was more than just a warning about the explosion. There was something deeper at play here, something bigger than just a failed business deal. "Who are they?" James muttered, his eyes scanning the note again. "What did they know?" Julia looked just as puzzled. "I don't know. He never explained it, but he seemed convinced that you were walking into something dangerous, something that had been planned for a long time." James's mind whirled with possibilities. Could it be that the people he had been dealing with, the ones who had orchestrated this deal, had known about the danger all along? Had they set him up? And if so, for what purpose? The note hinted at something larger, something hidden beneath the surface of everything he had been working toward. A sinking feeling settled in his chest. His entire career had been built on making the right calls, trusting his instincts, and reading people. But now, it seemed like he had been blind to something much darker. Lurking behind the deal he had been so eager to close. He folded the note carefully and slipped it into his pocket. "Thank you, Julia," he said quietly. "You've done more than you know." Julia gave him a small nod, her expression still troubled. "Just be careful, Mr. James. There's more going on than either of us understands." James left the hospital with a heavy heart, his thoughts consumed by the mystery that had saved his life and the lives of countless others. The explosion had been just the beginning, a symptom of something far more dangerous and insidious. As he drove back home, the city lights flickering through his windshield, he knew that his search for answers was only just beginning. The man who had warned him had sacrificed everything to save him from an untimely death. But the note, those cryptic, foreboding words, told him that the real danger was still out there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for its moment to strike. James wasn't just going to walk away from this. He couldn't. Not now. The meeting might have been a lie, but the truth was something he would have to uncover, piece by piece, even if it meant unraveling everything he thought he knew about his business, his partners, and himself. As the night wore on, the city skyline looming ahead, James knew one thing for certain. Someone had been playing a game with his life, and he was determined to find out who and why, before it was too late.